So hello, everyone. We'd like to welcome you to episode 2 of Liberty and Logos. In episode 1, we laid out what we see as broad strokes description of how humanity as a whole arrived at its current position, its current condition, referencing the key themes of Leviathan, politics, mass society, the state. Ecocide, the effect of this process on the environment and the interrelationships that it had with this ongoing process of enslavement, and also the spiritual dimension of humanity and how that has altered over time as well. So in episode 2, we'll be moving from how did we get here to more something like what can be done, not in sort of Lenin terms, what must be done or what should be done, but ideas of things that we could try as individuals, as communities, and as humanity to perhaps change this overall direction for the better. And on the first point of Leviathan, I know that you, Bellamy, have some ideas relating to an approach that you describe as Pan-secessionism. So would you like to give us a quick overview of what that means to you?
Yeah, and I want to clarify to begin with, I don't mean at all to claim that this is a novel idea of any kind. It's been proposed over and over across time. There are many people right now who are proposing it, and I think we will eventually have some of those people on the show to talk about it in more detail. And it's important too, I think, to make clear from the outset that and I think you would readily agree, do not think that any of the more common political avenues are an option. I do not believe at all that the Leviathan state can be reformed. I think that reform has been going on. I talk about in one of the issues of my journal, Backwoods, my print journal, that reform has been going on since civilization began. There have always been reformers. They certainly are capable of ameliorating the living conditions and the worst suffering of a given set or subset of the population in a given place and time, and that's perfectly commendable in many cases. And in many cases, reformers have very good intentions and are intelligent, sincere, righteous people, but it can't fix the big picture of the problem. If you look at the trajectory of, for example, the United States, the state in which I live, it across time has become a larger and larger, a more intrusive state, even as certain types of civil liberties have increased. It is always set against a backdrop of more and more war, more dangerous weapons, more surveillance, higher taxes, higher debt. And these sorts of problems can't be reformed away. You can't just get the right person or people into office or create the right NGO or new bureau to address these deep systemic problems, because they're baked into the logic and structure of the state itself. At the same time, I also don't accept the revolutionary model, which seeks to overthrow the existing state in order to replace it with an entirely new one. I think if you look at the track record of revolutions, it's very bad. Whether you look at the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution, in all these cases, you overthrow the existing state, and yes, you eliminate whatever particular depravities or perniciousness that particular incarnation of the state had, but you recreate the Leviathan. It's like one Leviathan eating another, and you end up with new atrocities, with new indignities. Often you have mass killings. Often no matter how good the intentions of the revolutionaries might be, and in some cases I think they just didn't have good intentions, but in some cases they did. But as soon as you put someone in that position of power, power corrupts. The idealism of a revolutionary might come up against hard rocks of reality, like having to suppress a counter-revolution and therefore creating an oppressive police state, or having to force the native population to abandon its previous cultural tendencies and therefore engaging in aggressive social engineering, imprisonment, re-education. These revolutions have a terrible track record. I mean, honestly, the United States, relative to others, had a fairly successful revolution. You didn't end up with an immediate tyranny, but even then, with these high-minded ideals of the founding fathers, and they certainly had their flaws. I don't mean to paper over that at all. They had major flaws, but they had many high-minded ideals. But it only took 2 centuries to go from that into a massive, unbelievably oppressive state that basically buys off its population with a relatively high standard of living for much of the population, and certain freedoms like speech and the right to bear arms that are now under attack. And at the same time, you have the world's largest prison population proportionally. Maybe China's is higher and they're lying. But so my point being that these normal avenues of political reform or revolution are, in my book, not very successful, certainly not able to overcome the deep problems that we talked about in the previous episode. Do you have anything to add to that?
If I
please
could
jump in. Yeah.
Jump in on revolution. I think that what's interesting to me is the dynamic whereby during the revolution, there's a comparatively larger sense of participation. Okay, you had Minutemen and other militias and the communities that supported them being very driven by ideology and a kind of momentum, wanting to kick the British out and establish a new life for themselves. And then after the revolution, you get this incredible narrowing of the discourse. And again, it's just in the hands of a few people and politicians. And what that allows for is people like Alexander Hamilton to come along, even within this relatively libertarian perspective, and say, yeah, let's have a central bank and start to bring in these terrible ideas. Right. And I think the clearest example of this that I've seen, my favorite revolution to talk about is one that often gets forgotten, which is the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. Yeah. In 1989. And the situation you had there, ultimately, in Prague, quite literally, you had almost all of the people involved in the throwing off of the state, to the point where the socialists there felt physically threatened and thought, well, these guys who are in these mass gatherings, which by this point had to be done outside the city because there was no room for them inside the city, they felt, well, we better kind of just say to these people, we're ready to give up. And then after the revolution, the people go back into the city, they start to go back to normal. They choose a people's hero in Václav Havel to kind of stand for them. And then very, very quickly, he does some very straightforward, banal, ordinary things, which effectively makes the Czech Republic, a sort of indistinguishable from any other country in Europe, which is in some ways what those people wanted, which is not a very lofty ideal. But yeah, I just wanted to add that dynamic of during the revolution, it's the many. After the revolution, it's the few who are driving forward the narrative.
Right. I think another good example that I've also written about briefly is the Haitian Revolution, where you had I think one of the clearest cases, at least at first glance, of what ought to seem a very justified revolution, where you literally have chattel slaves rebelling against slave masters. But it did not take long at all, and there were complicated reasons for this. I don't mean to paper over it, but it didn't take long at all after they threw the European slave masters out for them to reintroduce a plantation system that was not dramatically different from the one that came before, in terms of clearly having a agricultural working population under the heel of the few that were feeding off of them. And so I think one has to get outside the logic of the state model, and neither reform nor revolution can do that. And I think to me, the moment that we're in now, in terms of broad stroke strategy, it has to be our means need to resemble our ends, and our ethics need to be put at the forefront, and therefore it can't be the affect, the ethos behind it can't be we're going to force our vision on everyone and use the machinery of the state, either through reform, which basically means you're goading and lobbying the coercive state apparatus into doing your bidding, piece by piece, or the real jackboot and bayonet of the revolution, where you're essentially saying we're an agitated, angry minority, usually, right? An energetic, clever minority willing to use ruthless force and to force their vision on a population that is maybe ambivalent or even against what you're doing. Like in the American Revolution, supposedly about a third of the population supported it, about a third was actively opposed to it, and another third just sort of didn't really care or didn't want to be involved or was ambivalent. So you had one third pushing it on two thirds, and instead we need to engage in what, as you said, a pan-secessionist strategy, where people in their immediate communities are acting in and toward the lifeway that they want to have, and working to be left alone as much as possible. Therefore, you have that kind of voluntariness. You have that new world in the shell of the old. You have those means resembling the ends, and you are not using this model of force, coercion, distant management, and instead moving toward the lifeway that you want to have politically, ecologically, and spiritually at the same time. And there's so much more I want to say about this, but I'm going to cut it off there and give you a chance to comment.
I think all of that sounds great to me. And I think that the part that you're going to be coming onto, which is the one that sits a little uneasily with me, is that there's this idea that these very different groups, all of whom want to secede from the mass society, somehow take some kind of, not solidarity, but some common position in, I don't know if it's at the level of discourse or action or quite what. Perhaps you can speak more about that. in order to let's say help each other or help them or better help themselves. And that raises another question for me, which is like, what about if this is relatively successful and you start to see Leviathan breaking down into something more resemblant of a patchwork quilt of communities, each with their own different approaches? That seems like that would be a fertile soil for further conflict to breed. And this ties in, of course, with the whole idea of the power vacuum, that if you get rid of the Leviathan, there's going to be some kind of opposition or competition between different groups. And so one thing I've always felt about anarchism in general is that it's a way of saying, okay, we have a society, we'll get rid of the power structures, and we'll somehow expect people who disagree to get along. What you're talking about is not that. It's that these groups are actually now, there's a physical separation. They don't really see themselves as connected in the same way. But I still think that there's a sense in which I can imagine this not being very stable, I guess.
Yeah. So there are a few things in there, and I think you're raising the right criticisms for sure. So, yeah, how to unpack this? I've started using this phrase, the myriad marginals, to describe the various groups who more or less really don't like what's going on, don't like the society that they live in, would like to see something very different, but don't agree with each other. And so you have anarchists, anti-state communists, utopian socialists, right libertarians, anarcho-capitalists, religious fundamentalists, racial and ethno-nationalists of all different kinds, traditionalists, sort of Luddite type people, conspiracy theorists. There are a lot of, in the US, I'm guessing elsewhere as well, ex-military people who are very opposed to what's happening in American society. Maybe you can throw in some others as well. But
I think you've covered most of the ones that I think.
So the problem being that these are all small groups, individually small groups, and they, for the most part, don't like each other. And that, I think, works very much to the advantage of the power elite. The oldest political domination game in the book, as put by Philip of Macedon, Divide et Impera, divide and conquer, right? So the power elite are always a small group, generally even with their military and police enforcers, they're a small group. And so they're able to rule through propaganda, through a certain level of resignation and submission by the population. And because they always play these factions against each other, you see that now in the United States with, it used to be the United States ran on a kind of white supremacist ideology. Now it runs on this woke ideology that's being embraced by everyone from Hollywood to academia to Sprite and Gillette and Shell and various corporations, because it pits everyone against each other, women and men against each other, people of different races against each other, non-heterosexuals against heterosexuals, atheists against religious people, right? So we all hate each other, and unfortunately that same logic has bled into the radical milieu, in that I consider myself an anarchist. I know you don't really. I consider you an anarchist, though. But anarchists in North America have, in large part, imbibed this kind of woke ideology to some degree, or a more what they feel is a more extreme version of it, or something like that, or authentic version of it. And so I will have these exchanges with people. Like, I'm going to tell a story that leads to the point. The anarchist group Crime Think came to my town last May. I don't know if I told you this story. And they gave a talk about their book, From Democracy to Freedom. And the talk was, mostly as fine. But they kept during their talk invoking this term, the far right, like, these sort of demons. And so afterward, I said, I appreciated a lot of your talk, but you kept invoking the far right. And I just, when anarchists talk this way, I just think, okay, well, depending on how you define far right, we're talking about millions of people, maybe even more than 1 billion people. And these people are pretty much here to stay, right? So unless what is your vision of anarchism really? Is it people are left alone to voluntarily form organic communities and try to, a more sort of libertarian anarchist vision that says we try to live and let live, and we interfere with each other as little as possible? Or do you have a sort of world domination anarchist vision where somehow we're going to have, the world is going to run with like meetings federated into more meetings, and we're going to make global decisions bottom up, which sounds nightmarish and completely impossible. And we still try to have this kind of anarchist world society, which this is what a lot of anarchists believe. And I just find it bizarre. Not only because it's unworkable, but it would just be unlivable to try to make decisions that way. And if that is actually what you imagine, because some people will say, oh, well, if you want to have just these tiny communities, that's not anarchism either, because then everyone's just stuck in their own little village, and it might be very undesirable for them, and so they'll be oppressed in this tiny organic community, and therefore we need to create this world society where you can just travel anywhere and be anyone and live in liquid modernity forever. And if that really is your vision, then what are you going to do about all these people who don't want to live the way that you do, don't have the morality that you do, don't have the attitude of what constitutes proper social relations? And then you get to a point where you are going to be trying to force that down people's throats through guns, through re-education camps, through you're right back in the communist nightmare. And so when I used gentler language in this meeting than I did just now, but when I even talked about the fact that these far right people are going to live in your post Leviathan world, like, what are you going to do about the white nationalists? Like, my view would be leave them alone, let them form their own voluntary communities. What is the problem? And when I said this, it was as if Satan himself manifested in the room. The mere fact that I would countenance the peaceful coexistence with these people was unthinkable. And I thought that one of the people there was going to punch me in the face. And my point being with all this, we might cut some of this out, but my point with all this is that I don't see, as much as it might sound romantic or implausible to say all those myriad marginals that I just named could somehow get along, I see a greater likelihood and a higher intensity of violence through the world society, whether it's the world society that we are approaching now, or it's this sort of liberated idea of a world society that I just outlined. And it seems far more possible to me, even if it is a very romantic idea, that we could through doing alternative media like this, disseminate the idea in each of these subcultural milieu that I just described, this idea that the overall strategy is pan-secessionism. Our common enemy, as much as we may dislike each other, is the world Leviathan. It is globalism. It is this corporate monoculture and the techno-industrial infrastructure that makes it all hang together. And if we could agree to voluntarily secede, form organic communities, and agree to mutual non-interference and mutual defense pacts, I see that as maybe the only strategy going forward besides, some kind of accelerationism, which I just have so many problems with that we could talk about in a future episode.
Yeah, well, okay, so mutual non-aggression, I can imagine, okay? It would take time. It would take a number of individuals to exist in each group who excelled at diplomacy, tact, negotiation, compromise, and so on. But I can imagine, like, Richard Spencer in a room with Louis Farrakhan.
I can imagine that, yeah.
And after some time, them saying, all right, we'll leave each other the fuck alone. However, I think that one of the issues that comes in is mutual defense, because all the state has to do is go after one of them. And then you've got the whole concept of first they came for the Jews.
Yeah.
First they came for Alex Jones, and I said nothing because I wasn't Alex Jones. That kind of just one by one conquering of the marginals, and I can't see Richard Spencer lifting a finger, let alone putting his finger on a rifle trigger to defend Louis Farrakhan, or vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, these are sort of humorous examples to me because I don't know so much about Farrakhan, but Spencer, I mean, he's got this whole kind of like, I want to recreate the Roman Empire kind of thing. So I don't know that he would be the best diplomatic representative in my imaginary scenario, but
his equivalent, whatever.
Yeah, sure. I agree that would be one of the hardest steps to take. But I think the most likely way that my romantic scenario here, and I acknowledge it's far-fetched, could play out would be that these ideas get disseminated. Various subcultures start talking about them on their own to begin with, and they have to work out the contradictions and reluctance each within their own milieu of, oh, there's no way I'm gonna, some Antifa type anarchist, there's no way I would ever defend those people, blah blah blah, and some Christian fundamentalists over here saying, well, these people haven't given themselves to Christ, so why should I defend them? And they would have to, in their own internal dialogues, let this idea percolate until they can metabolize it. But I also think it's likely the only opportunity for this to emerge would be for the existing Leviathan states to start to break apart under some of their own contradictions, be they economic, ecological, political, in the sense of normal people having less and less confidence in existing institutions. By normal people, I mean people who aren't part of these fringe groups. So there would be a certain waiting for the conditions to be ripe. And I think in the case of these Leviathan states starting to break down, people would start to develop much more hard-boiled, gritty, realistic attitudes about what defense is going to look like when they can no longer rely on state police to defend them. And I think that might create a psychological shift of politics of pragmatism, of saying, okay, now we're these small, fragile groups, and there are going to be the remnants of state forces, the emergence of gangs and warlords. And so there might be a more practical attitude about mutual defense that right now is just unthinkable, because you just think, well, I just hate those people and I want nothing to do with them. And I'm not concerned for my safety because I have the cops and I have my house and such. So we'd be fighting on different terrain at that point.
That's fair enough. I want to do something at this point, because I think that this pan-secessionism conversation deserves a lot more focus, and maybe we can have in episode 3 more practical focus on sort of ecocide spirit, sort of to divide okay, this practical thing to two. Yeah. And so, but on this point, we can bring in one ecological angle in the form of another question, which is that if successful, and there's a kind of patchwork arrangement across, let's just say, North America, because each group will have very different views about behavior and norms and how to live, they might treat the environment very, very differently. And therefore, that could mean that one group creates externalities for another, which could be harmful, even lethal. And I wondered if you'd given any thought over to that. Would that be something that was discussed in the kind of these pacts, or do you have another way in which you can imagine it being?
Yeah, I think it's definitely one of the biggest questions, and I think it is something that would have to be resolved through some cross-cultural agreement about sort of property rights and land use rights, that if, let's say, I'm just going to use an arbitrary example, one group were doing heavy pastoralism and they were causing runoff into a river or stream that then flowed onto the territory of another group, and it was causing unacceptable eutrophication and that sort of thing. There would have to be some cross-cultural agreement about not being able to have heavy negative externalities like that. I mean, to some degree, externalities are unavoidable under any system. I think you end up with positive and negative externalities just by the fact that we are all ecologically bound together. And so inevitably people are going to have benefits and costs in small ways from the activity of others all over the world, but there would have to be some ability for dispute resolution. And I realize that opens the door to then, okay, well, how do you resolve conflict? Do you then have some sort of, international criminal court or something like that? And I guess I would say the answer is no, but you would have to, because I wouldn't want to create a formal overarching institution like that, but you would have to
Well, there have been market solutions proposed by the ANCAPs, which they call DROs, dispute resolution organizations, which are entities that offer their services to both parties and say, we will mediate on your behalf. And then, you're into this weird contractual arrangement where both groups agree to be bound. And I had never really understood any of that. And so this is why, for me, these questions are intensely complicated, because I just don't see much evidence at the micro level of people caring enough about compromise. And I think one of the things that I will come on to throughout our show is my sort of more recent shift in trying to personally in trying to look at people and look past all the differences. And it sounds cheesy as fuck, but as much as possible to empathize with them, put myself in their shoes and try and build some commonality. But this is something that I've really only started to do properly very recently, and I'm a middle-aged guy. And I also think that most people don't seem to do that, to be ready or capable or willing or something like that. And so amongst these groups, I think it's like there are too many requisites for this idea to be fully practical in a logical sense to me. Each of these groups would have to contain some people capable of diplomacy. And from what I've seen of documentaries made about neo-Nazis, those people are mostly thick as shit, and they don't have any diplomats amongst them. They also need to have, I mean, it's not just about like pastoral runoff. Some of these groups will want to engage in full-on industry, and then they will want to go after resources again because, well, they will. So I think that I'm not presenting an alternative vision, but and I really like your idea as a vision on the idealistic level. I think it's beautiful. The two issues I have is the practicality, and then also the fact that if I'm in my enclave and the next door enclave are people that I fundamentally disagree with, there's already a break between us. Practically, we could ignore that break and we could focus on just living our own lives. But part of me thinks, what is it that's caused this break? Why are they so different? And of course, if I'm assuming that my way of looking at things is comparatively good, I'm thinking, well, why are they comparatively off the mark? So I don't know. That's a kind of meandering thought, but I don't know if there's anything in there that you can get a hold of and play around with.
Yeah, a few things. I think you're familiar with this, but I'm just going to tell the audience. There is a kind of historical predecessor for the anarcho-capitalist dispute resolution organization in the form of pre-colonial Ireland had basically a private law system based on custom, and there were specialists called brehons who were essentially private mediators and arbitrators. And so this actually has been done, but it was being done in a pre-industrial, agrarian, culturally homogeneous society, which is
on a small island.
On a small island, and it's very different from trying to do this at a
continental level.
Continental level with massive, deliberate cultural heterogeneity. So I do think my idea, which again it's not original to me. People talked about this in, for example, the book Bolo Bolo. Someone recently told me something I haven't looked into. There's some group called Patchwork that's talking about something very similar. What's his name? The occultist guy that you like?
Robert Anton Wilson.
Yeah, he talked about it. I mean, lots of people have talked about this. Keith Preston talks about it.
Interesting that you would summarize him as an occultist. Yeah, okay.
Well, author, I don't know what you call him.
Psychologist, I would say.
Okay, honestly, I'm not all that familiar with him. Okay, so the idea is full of practical problems, but the point of this show and this new media I want to do is to put these ideas out there. Let's start talking about it. I'm not claiming at all to have even remotely worked out the practicalities of it. It's basically a vision, and I'm inviting dialogue. As far as the second part that you were saying, I think the biggest problem in the way of this idea is not logistical, it's actually psychological, in that we are so prone, maybe more now than before, but maybe it's endemic to the human condition, to this kind of Manichaean thinking that people who disagree with you, even very dramatically, they're not just mistaken, they're not just misguided, it's not just that maybe you are misguided or mistaken, or you need to compromise or something. It's that the people who disagree with you are demons, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you look at the way that the alt-right and the Antifa talk about each other now. It's like they think, I mean, not always, of course, but in many cases, they think the other person is not just wrong, but evil, and therefore can justifiably be harmed. And, they sometimes use this ghastly language to talk about each other in that way. And so I think the biggest obstacle is to realize that people are different. They have different desires about how they want to live. They're capable of changing. That we are capable of listening to each other and agreeing to disagree. And again, as you said, it sounds like this kind of cheesy thing or a sort of after-school special mentality, but it's actually being empathetic. It's actually being humane and saying, and I think it's just being practical, because do you really want to be at war with the entire world and to therefore play into the hands of the elite? Because I think the elite love it when they see these street fights between Antifa and alt-right. I think they laugh. They think it's fantastic. Look at all these. They cause
them a lot of the time.
They cause them. They encourage them. Look at all these stupid little people bashing each other. And so, just from a practical point of view, even if you despise these people who disagree with you, and you say to yourself, "I will despise them forever," still, just if you have any prospect for liberation at all, you need to set that to the side. And I think this does bump up against the spiritual question, which I guess we can talk about later, of realizing, if we are all
God's children,
participating in the divine ground of being, that on some level, when you do that, you are hating yourself. You are hating an aspect of yourself. And is that really how you want to exist? And I mean, do you really think that's going to bring you the deepest level of satisfaction? No. You'll be, if you have that mentality, you will be fighting against others and yourself for your entire life. And maybe some say, well, that's great. That's the, that's the heroic struggle. But no, I don't think so.
Yeah, I agree. I think that would be a very, very good point to leave it. I'm feeling pretty tired now.
Sure.
And I think when we get round to episode 3, we can start off with the spiritual dimension that we were just about to go into. See if there's any other bits of the ecological, what can be done that we want to get into. And then we'll have had a really great overall picture of where we're at and what our views are, I think.
Okay. Well, once again, thank you for joining us. It's an honor to have people listen and take it seriously. And please consider subscribing and following us. We'll have that information in the show notes. And please, more importantly, consider giving us a comment or a question or a criticism, and we will try to get back to you. And please tune in next time.
Thank you.